Hello, Keeling World Culture students. This is Miss Crouch.
And Mr. Schoaf.
Unfortunately, Mr. Jackson can't be with us today.
But he is here in spirit.
Today we're going to be discussing the Middle Ages or medieval Europe. This is a time from about 400 Common Era to 1400 Common Era that lies between two periods known as the Classical Europe, which we've studied, which involved the rise and fall of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and another period known as Modern Times, which starts with Renaissance Europe, which we'll be studying later. Middle Ages actually means, it's Latin for, medieval, is Latin for Middle Ages. It makes sense because it's in between these two other periods, Classical Europe and Modern Times. There's a few characteristics that really are central to the Middle Ages, and those include the rise of Christianity, the Holy Roman Empire, the Crusades, the feudal system, and the growth of cities. And we'll be talking about all of those today.
So let's talk a little bit about the rise of Christianity. As you've learned before when we studied our three monotheistic religions that originated in the Middle East, with Christianity, the disciples Peter and Paul, they moved to Rome from Palestine to spread Christianity in the 40 CE. Now, as you've already learned, Christianity spread slowly in the Roman Empire. It was persecuted by emperors such as Diocletian and among others, but by the fall of the empire in the 400s, people like Constantine and Theodosius had made Christianity the required religion of the Roman Empire. So actually, when the Western Empire fell, Christianity ended up filling this power vacuum and becoming the dominant religion in Western Europe. Now, as Christianity grows, eventually they had a split that we need to talk about, and by 1054, Christianity split into two different sects or groups. So in 1054, it was known as the East-West Schism, but also it can be known as the Great Schism. In the western part of Europe, we had the Roman Catholic Church. They were in the West. The Holy Roman Empire would eventually be a part of this as well. The leaders in communities were called bishops. They were the leader in towns, and the whole church was led by a pope who was basically the bishop in Rome. Now, the pope lives in Vatican City today. He is still the head of the Catholic Church. In the east, however, a part of Europe, it was called the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now, this was the Byzantine Empire. As you recall, the Roman Empire only declined and fell apart in the west. In the east, it was still going strong, but we call it the Byzantine Empire. Now, make sure you understand, the pope was not the leader of this Christian church. Instead, the Byzantine emperors were actually the ones who were considered the head of the church, just like they were the head of the empire. This is similar to the way it was back in the Roman Empire. Other things about rise of Christianity, both used missionaries to spread their faith. Male people who had devoted their lives to Christianity were known as monks, and females who devoted their lives to Christianity were known as nuns. Christianity is a proselytizing religion, which means that one of the main purposes is to spread out and to convert others. This is going to be one of the main reasons that people leave Western Europe to go to Palestine, or what we would call the Holy Land, to reclaim, or to try to reclaim this land for Christianity. And that's called the Crusades, and we'll get into a little bit more about that later. The other thing you have to remember is that a lot of the learning and a lot of the knowledge was only being carried on in a lot of these Christian churches and these Catholic churches. They founded universities. Some of the earliest ones were Bologna and Oxford. Now, these were based on churches' teachings, but they copied manuscripts and they kept a lot of the scholarship alive that may have fallen apart a bit after the fall of the Roman Empire. So this is just a map of the Byzantine Empire, and there's a few things that we can see. One, shows you a little bit map of where the Eastern Orthodox Church was. You also show that it was being attacked on both sides, one by the Turks and on the other side by Hungarians. Also, the Holy Roman Empire is over here on to the west. Now, this is about the time of the Crusades. So eventually, as we said, we're going to talk about people leaving Western Europe, some from the Holy Roman Empire, traveling all the way over down here, just south of Syria, to the Holy Land to try to regain this land for Christianity. Now, the end result is that a lot of people were killed, but we'll also talk about some of the spread of culture. So what is this Holy Roman Empire? Well, first thing to remember is this is not the same Roman Empire we studied before. This is completely different. It's just named after them kind of in honor. But what happened after the fall of the empire? So you had a lot of these Germanic peoples who were settling and creating kingdoms. These were warrior kingdoms, they were pretty fierce kingdoms, and a lot of them were actually Christian as well. They converted to Christianity, sometimes a different form of Christianity, but we had the Franks, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, the Visigoths, among others. they tried, they were constantly at war with one another, and we remember them as being pretty fierce people. They combined their common law, and this was a combination of unwritten laws that came from local customs, also with Roman law. Now, the most important guy that we want to talk about from the Holy Roman Empire is Charlemagne. Now, Charlemagne, who also is known as Charles the Great, he was elected king of the Franks in 771. Now, the Franks are one of these Germanic tribes. Actually, the country of France takes its name from the Franks. They were a Germanic people. They settled in modern-day France and Germany. He established an enormous empire through conquest. And he did it in the name of Christianity. Now, by 800, his empire has gotten so big that the Pope decided to declare him protector of the Roman Catholic Church. And thus, Charlemagne became the Holy Roman Emperor and the leader of the Holy Roman Empire. This title of Holy Roman Empire or Holy Roman Emperor would be passed along and spread, and actually it wasn't passed along just by title. A lot of times people, bishops had to come together and decide who it was going to be in the future. But the first time we hear the name Holy Roman Empire is in 800. Now, I do want to talk about when Charlemagne died. He did not just hand it all to his oldest son, he actually split it up between all his sons. This is significant because, and this was a Frankish tradition, but it was significant because these divisions form some of the borders of modern day countries today. All right, we mentioned the Crusades. Let's talk a bit about them. So, the Holy Wars, beginning in around 1096 CE. This was when people from Western Europe made the decision to go and travel thousands of miles to Palestine to try to reclaim the Holy Land for Christianity. Now, how did this come about? Well, first of all, as we showed you before, the Byzantine Empire was getting squeezed. They were a little worried about a lot of the territory they were losing, and so the emperor at that time, Alexios I, and this is in about 1054, he sends a message to Pope Urban and says, hey, I need you to send us a bunch of people. Basically, he's asking for help to kind of fight the Turks and other people who were fighting against the Byzantine Empire. And really, one of the goals was to take back this Holy Land, which you see right here. Now, when I say Palestine, when I say Holy Land, it's a Holy Land to Christianity, it's a Holy Land to Judaism, and it was a Holy Land also to Muslims. Now, the Caliphate had conquered this area in the 600s, and had basically held it since then. Well, part of this religious fervor that Pope Urban started said that it was a Christian's duty to go and now reclaim this land. Now, let me talk about a little bit about these First Crusades. So, the First Crusade was in 1095 to 1099. This one's significant because it established the Kingdom of Jerusalem, right here, also the Principality of Antioch. A lot of these were, all of these, or most of these kingdoms were established during this time. For the next 100 years, they would be run by basically knight kings. The Second Crusade, we don't really have to mention much about it. They tried to take more lands, but they failed. By the Third Crusade, which is about 100 years after the original Crusader kingdoms were created, this is also called the King's Crusade because some famous kings were involved from Western Europe. But it's notable because Saladin, who was a Muslim leader of Egypt, a very respected leader, he ended up retaking Jerusalem from the Crusaders, and they would never take it back. We like to mention the Fourth Crusade just because of how ridiculously horrible it was, and it got off to a bad start. They weren't very well provisioned. On their way to the Holy Land, they decided to stop in Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and ask for some more supplies. Well, the Byzantine Empire saw them at the gates and said, no, you're not coming in. So instead of going and trying to liberate the Holy Land, the Crusaders sacked Constantinople instead. Now see what's happened here. In just over 110 years, after the emperor of the Byzantine Empire had asked for help to fight these Muslims and to actually try to conquer them, instead, these crusaders of going to the Holy Land had actually sacked Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Here's just a map. You can come back to this and you can look at a few things if you would like, but this basically shows the First Crusade, Second Crusade, Third Crusade, and Fourth Crusade. And I am going to point out the Fourth Crusade because this is the one that comes through and actually never makes it to the Holy Land and actually comes and sacks Constantinople instead. Oh, so feudal system. Feudalism is the medieval social and political structure based on agriculture. This was the way that most people's lives were organized. Most people were farming, and when they were farming, they usually were on a manor while they were doing this. Now, in order to understand how a manor works, you do have to understand about the lord-vassal relationship. And we're going to talk more about that in just 1 second on the next video. Lord and vassal relationship, as we were talking about before. Now, you could be both. In theory, you had these lords that were at the very top. Now, lord is a title, but it also just meant somebody who had a lot of land, and these titles are usually passed down by birth. They could give land, and then also protection to nobles. The nobles would then take this land, and they would provide loyalty in soldiers, so they would be vassals to this lord. Technically, you could be both a lord and a vassal if you were in the middle, because the lords at the very top obviously are kings, and they're going to be bishops. But what is a manor? It is a feudal estate. It is, you have the lord who owned the manor. You have tenant farmers who were paid to work on the land, and they're growing whatever it is to grow. There's no stores, so everything has to be made on the manor. However, most people were serfs. Now, if you want to imagine a horrible existence, this is what serfs were. They were tied to the land. Essentially, they were slaves. They were bought and sold with the land. They did most of the work on a manor, farming, building, cooking. They got up at sunup. They worked all day. They went at sundown. They never had a day off, and basically they lived very, very difficult lives.
And just to give you a visual of what feudalism looked like, there's a very basic kind of graphic that shows you the feudalism triangle. And this shows you in population, money, power, and land, what feudalism looked like. So at the bottom, you have the most amount of people in terms of population, and you have the peasants, which are the people, the tenants and the serfs working the land. Then above them, you have fewer people, but with more power, money, and land, and these are knights. And knights are the ones that are leading these tenants and serfs into battle, for example, into the Crusades, and knights were born into the position. It wasn't something you could rise to socially. Above the knights, you've got people with even more power, money, and land, but of course fewer of them, in the nobles and the clergy. Nobles were, as Mr. Schoaf explained, the lords and the people that had inherited land or money from their fathers. Clergy were the leaders in the church. These would be, for example, bishops, and they also held a lot of power. Kings are, of course, the fewest number of people, but they're the people with the most money, power, and land. You could also put the Pope up here, since, as we discussed earlier, the Christian church had a tremendous amount of power during this time. And people often looked to the church as a leader paramount to their king or lords. The last thing that we're going to talk about with Middle Ages is the growth of cities. And towns and then cities became incredibly important, both economically and socially during this time. The reason they were so important is because they were independent of the lord's control. They weren't based on a manor system or feudalism, so they were outside of the lord's control. They grew so quickly because a lot of towns were on the way to the Crusades, as you saw on the map earlier. And crusaders, thousands of men were coming through and needed supplies for their trips, needed places to stay, needed food and such, and also to restock along the way, shipbuilding materials, etc. They also became centers of manufacturing and trade. Guilds came about, which were worker organizations, kind of like today's unions, and apprenticeships began to be the kind of equivalent education system of the time. Apprentices were people that worked under a master to learn a specific trade or skill. There were no schools at the time like we have today, so this is how people learned trades and learned their careers. They would work for many years under a master until they had mastered a trade, and then take over for the master when they died or stopped. So eventually these towns grew into cities because people were flocking to these places because of their economic importance. So kings and church leaders had to find a way to control the people even in these large cities. And they did that by building cathedrals and granting charters. Cathedrals, of course, are large, very ornate, and often very beautiful churches. And charters are basically documents that the elite or kings had to sign that granted the common people rights, civil rights. An example of a famous charter would be the Magna Carta, which was signed in 1215 by King John, and it was a document that basically gave rights to his landowners. And it's not that he did it out of the kindness of his heart, he was actually kidnapped and forced to sign it. But that document, the Magna Carta in specifics, later influenced constitutional law. So that's our presentation on the Middle Ages. We hope you enjoyed it.
Yes, we do hope you enjoy it. We love talking and then posting ourselves on the interwebs. So get used to this. We're going to be doing more in the future.
Bye.